What is the most probable scenario in the case of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon? Was what happened to the girls on their trip to Panama an accident, or is it more probable that they have met foul play? Well, friends, before we dive into the actual rabbit hole, into the actual meat of this case, I kind of wanted to apologize. As I mentioned, I planned to release part 3 and 4 on the same day, but I recorded them a day apart. So, of course, yesterday I just felt like complete crap, so I don't sound well. I talk a lot slower than I usually do. I'm just not at like a 200 where I usually am at when I record these videos. So sorry about that. I don't usually share like my personal life on this channel, which, I mean, let me know if you want. It's just not really something natural to me. But let's just say that people who watched Hunger Games for one particular connection with Katniss, with one person, might relate to me, or maybe just if you're not a psychopath. But why I was so gripped by the Hunger Games, I swear there's a point to this, is that Katniss always felt like it would be her worst punishment, her worst fear, to watch people surrounding her, to watch people who matter to her dying. And yesterday, just before pressing that record button, I've heard of a family member of mine getting a prognosis, and as you might realize if you have had somebody go through that, a prognosis usually isn't a good thing. It's a matter of days or weeks, so that's also why like my mental health and like I couldn't be at 100%. So what I'm trying to say is put some speed to the video and also like put your most comfortable PJs and go hug your grandparents. I can't change my great-grandma's prognosis, but we can make a difference to this video. If we find the right people, if we are serious enough, if we find the professionals, the experts in certain areas, I think the families of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon can have the answers for sure. So that's why we are here. That being said, let us actually dive into the meat of the video. Before dividing this into the accident, possible theories there, like the strongest evidence that we have there, and then going through what I said in part 3, the lists and the flow, and then doing the exact same thing for foul play, let us just summarize the evidence that we have that we are going to be referring to. So basically just like a quick summary of videos 1 to 3, because that is the evidence that is going to be playing into these theories. Here we'll be referring to the rucksack, the data, and the bones. So speaking of the rucksack, we know it was found in the Alto Romero district. We know that it was found with some tears, which would make sense if it was dragged through the water and then just planted there, or if the river was actually dragging the rucksack on its own. Inside of the rucksack there was some residue of sand and leaf and some soil. The devices were left inside of it, as was some money, as were the bras, as was one bottle of water that was never tested, and the devices were not in the working order, but they managed to be salvaged through the forensics later. So the cards still managed to be processed and we have recovered the calls and the data from those cards. The DNA profiles collected from the rucksack didn't yield anywhere. They only managed to exclude their own employees. So NFI and Panamanian authorities that were processing that rucksack were excluded, but they also managed to exclude Kris and Lisanne's DNA, meaning that it was washed away or washed off the items inside and outside of the backpack for some reason. One last bit about the DNA that we have to discuss that I saved for this part is the DNA on the shorts and in general how Kris's shorts have been found. Because I think the biggest myth, one of the biggest myths in this story, apart from, everything being found upstream, there's some more, but the big one is that Kris's shorts have been found just folded, like completely dry and on a rock. Which isn't true, but just like with everything in this story, it is far from being that simple. According to the imperfect plan, unlike what you would hear in the press, in the early press releases, the case officials stated that the jeans, the short jeans, were found soaked and stuck on a dead tree branch that was partially submerged in a waterfall on the Serpent River. The location is roughly around 5 kilometers from where they were last thought to be. And according to Matt and this picture, when the shorts were discovered, they had multiple holes. And if you recall pictures 507 and 508, the shorts didn't have these holes on them. There was also some dirt found on the shorts, but just like with the holes, we don't know were they caused naturally due to the river conditions or by something else. Just like with every single piece of evidence, as I am reading the reports on it, I'm like, wow, well, this is case closed, like, we have definitive information. And then you learn that it can be something else. So that is what happens with Kris's shorts as well. Because the official reports state that there is no trace of bodily fluid, nor skin cells of any type. This would on the surface mean that you can discard sexual assault or rape or like third-party DNA, but obviously that could be rinsed off by the river. But what couldn't, according to plenty of sources, is Kris's own DNA. Rather, and I absolutely hate when I talk about these parts, it's like Lacey Peterson's case all over again. So, when the body decomposes, we assume that the shorts fall off, like, right, they slide off the body as it's decomposing. Well, the decomposing flesh, like the remnants, the DNA off of it, would have stained the shorts, and those stains wouldn't have necessarily been washed off by the river. Or, as Matt puts it nicely in a more professional way, when people die wearing their clothes, the decomposition process usually allows for body fat to penetrate the clothing fabric in a way which cannot simply be washed off. That can mean that Kris's shorts were removed or slid off her body quite soon after she died, or it could mean like a completely different thing, just like with everything else. In terms of data that we have from the phones and the camera between the 1st and the 11th of April 2014, we know there was a pattern between the 4th and the 6th, when the phone was switched on and off during the same times of the day, usually between 10 and 11 and 11 and 2 p.m. We then know that the Samsung phone died and that the PIN on Kris's iPhone hasn't been entered from the 5th of April. Then, between the 7th and the 10th, we have nothing. No camera photos, no iPhone photos, the phones haven't even been attempted to be switched on or off. During that time, the night between the 7th and the 8th, in the early morning hours of the 8th, we have the night pictures that we referred to in part 2, about 90 of them, if I remember right, that were taken on the camera. That was out of the ordinary because the last picture that we know that has been taken on that camera is picture 508 of Kris crossing a little stream. And then we know that picture 509 has been eliminated. In part 2, we discussed how this hasn't been done in such a way where the girls would have done it on the camera, that it was done in post-production, possibly by somebody who was actually processing the data and processing the pictures. Basically the police and the investigators. And the last piece of data we have from Kris's iPhone was that it was switched on the 11th, it stayed on for over an hour, and then it was switched off. And that is where their digital trace dies. When it comes to their bones, we know that only 2 elements of Kris's skeleton have been found, her pelvic bone and her rib bone. Kris's remains have been bleached, in particular her pelvic bone. Lisanne's bones haven't been bleached, and there were more remnants of her skeleton that were found. I found 2 different versions. I found between 28 elements and 33. More sources state 28 elements after I've been researching this for a couple of weeks. Her tibia and her femur have been found, and those are the bones of the leg, so a thigh bone and a shin bone. And based off of those two bones and Lisanne's foot that has been found inside of a shoe, they have determined that Lisanne has exerted herself, meaning that she has probably lived longer than Kris and that she might have exerted herself through walking, running. The state in which her bones have been found is usually the state of the bones we would see on inexperienced runners or hikers who then go on for marathon runs or really long hikes. Important thing when it comes to the bones was that there were no scratches, neither natural ones or cultural ones. Something that I will not be discussing and you haven't seen me discuss in any of these parters is the animals. From everything I've read, that isn't really a plausible theory that the animals have gotten to these girls, mostly because the animals would have left some trails. We would be able to see it on the bones, and especially if the animals were responsible for how Lisanne's body has been dismembered and how her foot has been found. And even more importantly, people emphasize how neither Kris's nor Lisanne's skulls have been found, and skulls couldn't be eaten by anybody, any animal that you would be able to find in the jungle. Like, they just wouldn't be able to process the skulls and the bones in their digestive system. What this implies is that if it was a doing of an animal, or even possibly of a cannibal, which isn't really discussed here, but we would be able to see some teeth traces on the girl's bones. If it was a doing of a weapon, such as a knife or a machete, we would be able to see the scratches, but also if it was a doing of a river, the bodies being dismembered and then floating amongst the rocks, we should also be able to see traces of that. One last thing on the bones though is about the river currents, how Serpent River is very much inconsistent. During April, when the girls had disappeared, the river was said to be slow moving. But then we know that the flash flood started happening, that it started raining heavily. So later, in April, we can assume that the river multiplied in size. This was due to the increased rain, drastically increasing the depth and the movement of that river. What that would indicate is that if girls died at the bank of the river and then the river has just swollen, as our girl Bessie said, has risen in size and picked up the bodies of the girls, the corpses would be floating along the river post-mortem as they are releasing the gases on the inside. But eventually, as the bodies would have been decomposing between April and June, when most of the remains would be found, the bones that would remain wouldn't float. Bones, according to Kris's research for the imperfect plan, are more dense than water, meaning that they will sink to the bottom of the river, meaning that they're more likely to be trapped between the rocks, and that in turn would mean that they would separate from the corpse, that would sink and receive visible scratches if they were actually moving along the bottom of the river. Understanding the rainfall would help us understand two different things. The first one being, why did the bodies break into pieces in the water quickly compared to how they would have broken up into pieces on land? And secondly, it would help us understand the decomposition rate. Is it even possible that due to natural causes, due to how bodies usually decompose in water, that their bodies decomposed in two completely different ways, and also that between April and June they were already reduced to bones? If serious about this case, about the theories, you can, as I mentioned, fill out the sheet just to run these different theories, to run the flow, to run the pros and the cons, to make it up in the list and see what actually makes sense as something that could have happened on those days. And I'd really encourage you to check the sources that I have used in the research. So you have Kris and the Perfect Plan that you can contact for any scientific data that you can provide if you are an expert in certain topics, because from everything I've seen, that is mostly what his blog is all about. then you can contact Scarlett from Cold Case and comment on her blog posts. It will be in the description box. That avenue is more like theories, but like also extremely detailed on everything, from like every conspiracy theory that you can think of to like the actual factual data broken down. And then you have Juan and his Google Drive for all of the images, like any image that you could have found online of Kris and Lisanne ever, of the people involved in the story that we mentioned for the parts, and also on all of the other possibilities of like conspiracy theories, cover-up, Photoshop. Check them out, get in touch with them if you have any plausible theories that people have missed out on based on certain factual information, and let us really try to get to the bottom of this, but in a serious way. Not just by saying things just for the sake of it. Give them the time of day if you're interested, because there are people who have spent months and months, if not years and years, researching, writing up on this topic, and investing in all different theories. So if I don't cover something, they probably had, and you can go down a rabbit hole with them and then engage into discussing this topic further. And in that way, maybe we can actually get somewhere. Where we are getting now is to the accident slash possible fall section. The gist that you probably felt through parts 1 to 3 is that there are two wildly different opinions in this area. One is you absolutely cannot get lost on El Pianista Trail. It's clearly marked, you cannot get lost, like you wouldn't have just strayed away, there's clearly marked pathways, like you wouldn't have just gotten like into a pasture, like gotten off that path. And the second one is that it is rough terrain, it is jungle, it's easy to get lost, it's easy to get dehydrated, it's easy to, be thirsty, not think rationally. The reason why there are two completely different aspects to this story is because people are different. You might not have a great sense of orientation, like your homegirl here. Zero sense of orientation. Could be on this same street that I have lived on for the past 5-6 years from a different angle and not recognize that it is my street. So somebody like me might be more biased to buy into a theory like this. And then there's some of you who will just be like, no, never got lost in my whole ass life, would have never taken a shortcut, would have never taken a different route and then got lost because of it, would have always backtracked, experienced hikers, all of that. So I'm passing the baton on to you here. I'm gonna play 2 videos. I'm playing the first one first for a reason. This one I partially played in part 3, but I'm playing here again because this is the Kremers family retracing the route that the girls would have taken. And I'm playing it because of a particular thing that they have said.
En ze weten hoe lang ze hebben gelopen. Dus dan zouden ze rechtsaf keer hebben gemaakt. En zoals ik al zei, het pad tot hier is 1 pad, geen afslag. Je kan hier niet komen. Ja, we gaan weer terug. Het is ons wel duidelijk eigenlijk.
Nou ja, wij geloven niet dat ze van het pad af is gegaan. Dat geloven we echt niet.
Nee, precies. Zo stom is ze niet.
Zo stom is ze niet. En je moet hier echt moeite doen om te gaan verdwalen. En dat gaan ze echt niet doen.
Nee.
Als ze wat gebroken zouden hebben, zouden ze zeker op het pad blijven.
Ja, en er zijn ook langs het pad geen steile hellingen of ravijnen waar je in kan donderen en daar dan niet meer gezien wordt. Het is goed om het zelf gelopen te hebben nu. Een heel stuk.
Just the pain in Royalie's eyes, Chris's mom's eyes, as she's walking this same route is the stuff of nightmares. But I play this for the pure reason for you to hear them say their daughter isn't that stupid. She wouldn't have just turned straight away from the indicated path. But now let me play you the video, some excerpts from the Lost in the Wild. as King of Phillips and the guy that I have still not noted his name down, I'm so sorry mate, of the two of them retracing that same pathway.
Look how wide this trail is. Like, to me right now, if it continues on like this, you don't get lost on this.
Right.
You don't slip and fall and then 20 days of searching doesn't find you.
There are a lot more people out here than I expected.
Ah.
So let's go.
As you can see, the two of them are saying that the pathway after El Pianista isn't as clearly marked.
This is it. This is the top.
That would be the Pacific Ocean over there. And then that way would be Caribbean Sea.
So this is the Continental Divide. And look at this. This is the memorial to the girls. They put their deceased date as April 1st. That's the day that everything went wrong.
Also, something that I noticed in both of those recordings is that it is really foggy. And that's something I noticed across pictures, across like different videos that I have watched on Scarlett's channel. Of course, we know on the first that it was sunny, but beyond that, as the night keeps falling and the twilight is coming early, you can also see that the fog and the nightfall might have contributed here.
This is unreal.
Yeah, we're in a trench right here. Look at that. 20 feet up. If I was from here, and if I was going after the girls, and I was quiet about it, and they were making noise, you could watch them from right up here. This is the perfect terrain to surveil them. And then look, you pop down, and you say, yeah,
Now, where am I going to go?
you're trapped.
Something that I don't take lightly and I never exclude out of my videos if I can find it is the parents' comments, because they can give us the actual insight into this girl's mind. And if they are saying that Kris wouldn't have gotten lost, that she wouldn't have taken just a different pathway, I'm inclined to believe them. So what are the other options? The most common reasons for somebody actually following the right path, then deciding, okay, we need to turn back, and then after some point realizing maybe they have been lost, would be not backtracking. We can assume from the data on the cameras after that point that they haven't taken any pictures. Picture 508, the one on the stream, is the last one taken that day. 509 could have been taken at any point before the night pictures. So to a certain degree, we know they haven't been using their camera and their phones to make a note of where they're going, to snap pictures so that they can then later return. We don't know if they have used something in the nature, any form of like markers to mark up their way, whether it is twigs or whether it is like actual drawings, like marking up the trees, anything like that. You guys have pointed it out that the book says it is jungle, that it really isn't jungle by definition, that saying lost in the wild indicates that it is again rough terrain, that they did get lost. It kind of insinuates where the conclusion is going to lie, but we gotta admit it isn't like they went down a road in London, let's say, based on where I am at. Backtracking in those areas, even if it is the exact same pathway, isn't the same as backtracking down the street to your house. Because there is vegetation, there is brush, that is also why the guides, according to the book and other sources, do carry some sort of machete or knife as they walk these areas, in order to clear the small vegetation, the brush on the sides. Let us speak about the psychology of that, because if we are not saying that they got lost, that they have strayed away from the path, that either means that they have just continued down that path without realizing the time and then decided to stay there, and that is where they call the emergency services, or that they decided to backtrack and that is how they maybe have gotten lost. According to survival specialist Megan Hine, the jungle can be extremely disorientating. The process of getting lost contains three main phases. Phase 1 is the navigational error. So this is the one where you make a mistake and you can just wander off the right path. Phase 2 is called gray zone. And this is where things slowly but surely start to look different to you. So you start panicking, thinking that something is wrong. And most people during this phase convince themselves that they are not lost. And then phase 3 is the recognition, and that is when people can no longer deny that they really are lost. Even if you were to realize that you have gotten lost, the urge to walk can still be almost irresistible, especially in the strange environments or in the environments that you are unfamiliar with. This is when fight or flight will set in. That is the response that is ingrained in all of us. And when somebody gets lost, that fear can turn into panic that is called wood shock, which is this blind panic that leads you to irrational behavior. And this behavior is usually propelled by the urge to flee. Usually the fight or flight response phase wouldn't last for very long. Most people would at this point come up with a plan of some sort of how to get themselves out of that situation. And this plan, when it comes to the lost hikers, involves following a river or a stream, if they can find one. This means that the lost hikers would follow the natural route or the path of least resistance, causing what is called a funneling effect, a natural route which the lost would seem to resort to and to keep pursuing. So if we are listening to Kris's parents and the girls wouldn't have strayed away from the path, wouldn't have gotten lost in that way, it means they have either continued going forward, realized the darkness might be coming upon them, trying to figure out, maybe even by following that pathway, is there a shortcut, can they just turn somewhere and then return? We don't know, did they access the Google Maps, the offline maps that they had on their phone, or did they have the physical ones on them to try to figure out a route, or that they decided to backtrack and something went wrong there. Something that I haven't seen mentioned because people don't think about like physiological needs as much as I do, but possibly they had to pee at some point. If they had been walking the whole day drinking from those bottles of water, they had to find a bush, maybe stray away from the pathway. I assume they wouldn't just stay on that same path where people are crossing and look at one another as they're fulfilling their physiological needs, let's be honest. So what if upon returning from the bush, just from like that pathway, they suddenly were like, oh, which way is which? Like, should we continue that way? They continue down the pathway and realize this is not the way back. Then on the fight or flight mode, that can be supported by the data on their phones, by the emergency call that was made, and them deciding to switch their phones off for the evening after having checked their batteries. Something that the documentary Lost in the Wild does quite well, and this could very well be scripted, like, let's be honest, we know how scripted things can be in production, but there is this immediate switch, immediate survival mode, even though the two of them could have returned home, but they decided to camp out during the night to see the conditions of where they presumed Kris and Lisanne could have gotten to. And immediately they establish the sleeping rota. So like one person is staying awake, keeping guard, and you can see like all of the insects, the mosquitoes flying against the light, and you know, or well, we have to presume that if this is what has happened to the girls, they would have gotten into that survival mode themselves, and also they wouldn't even have the light. The only flashlight they could have had would be either from the camera or the phone, so unless they use the flash from the cameras, which we would have probably known because the pictures would have been taken, the girls would have at some point been in complete pitch darkness. And then finally, in this theory, according to the multiple people that they have interviewed for this book, all of them state that the girls would have tried to find the river. They would have tried to go downhill. Obviously, it is logical, but it's also trying to find a source of water and just trying to find the riverbed, because possibly, probably, the cell signal might be better in an open area on the same altitude where Boquete is versus like you going up the high spot on the mountain. And according to Robert Koster, who is the founder of the International Search and Rescue Database, they have recorded thousands of disappearances. And they have split different patterns in 4 different categories: climber, angler, hiker, and camper. And the girls would have fallen under the hiker category. And interestingly, hikers would actually do the opposite from what I just said. They would go uphill to look for network coverage, but then instinctively, when they realize there is none, they would walk downhill towards the water source. But the rivers in the Panamanian jungle are often located in these deeply cut canyons, full of slippery rocks. Even the stream that the girls have been crossing looked slippery, looked like the water was just moving in the current that you wouldn't be able to predict. You've seen from the Lost in the Wild the monkey bridges and the stream of water that was underneath them that would have carried away anything or anybody if you were to fall into it. And this in turn, this natural instinct for us to find a body of water can actually lead to great danger. Because you can end up at a point where the way back is just too slippery or too steep, and you would have a ravine next to you that is just too high. So if we are to assume that they have went behind the Mirador, following the Serpent River and trying to find a water source, that area would have imprisoned a hiker, because it is full of the steep ravines and the body of water that is unpredictable. And if this had happened, it could have explained why the phones would no longer be turned on at a certain point, because if you are stuck at some point, it's kind of pointless for you to stop checking for the cell service, which is something that I mentioned in part 2 when we discussed the data and the lack thereof between the 7th and the 10th. Because at some point, like, what is the point? If you are stuck, if one of them is hurt and the other one is too tired to even continue moving, then you can understand how they might have at some point even given up on checking the cell service, because they knew eventually their phones are going to die. What we can still pretty much discard when it comes to the accident theory is falling off the monkey bridge, because they wouldn't have been able to reach it on the day before they have dialed that emergency number. And if they were to have fallen, well, then their phones would have probably been damaged if one of them had fallen and had a rucksack on her. Again, presumptions. And truly, after watching that documentary by Kinga Phillips, I can't imagine why beyond that day, beyond the happy times, beyond the times that they're relaxed and actually wanted to experiment with the monkey bridge, would have hopped onto one when they're hungry, possibly dehydrated, disorientated. I don't see it unless literally it is some next level hallucinations where the only thing you see is something being beyond that bridge, something that you desperately need. But that idea has pretty much been discarded even by the prosecution service, even by the authorities in Panama. And the idea that they have settled on is an accidental fall, possibly from a cliff. That brings us to the list, the accident theory pros and cons list, and the third column, which is the info that we still need in order to make a decision. You could play around here on the sheet or by yourself if you don't want to share it with the people in terms of the other accidental theories, the possible cliff one, the monkey bridge one, whichever one you want to play with. I try to make them as generalized as possible. So I'm not going to read everything, just a couple of patterns, because with every theory, so accident and foul play, different foul play ones, I think there is something that can be used as the strongest point of contention, as the strongest factual evidence for that theory. Let me know what you see when it comes to the accident theory. I think here it is the phone data patterns and those camera pictures. And then followed by the remains that would explain that one of them died before the other. Everything else is pretty much speculation and psychology. So, did they check their phones and realize the batteries are low? Did they go to even have that hike that day because they were pissed off and had so much time on their hands? How experienced they were as hikers? Where those night pictures have been taken? The water currents that would explain the lack of the remains found. And when speaking about the arguments against, I think the highest ones on the list for me is the Kris's parents' argument that they wouldn't just get off the beaten path. And something that we can really say about the girls that have written diaries, that have taken diaries to write them during their gap year, is that they would have left some form of goodbye notes or videos, and that they would have probably used that camera in order to capture wherever they went. So the fact that they suddenly stopped following that pattern from that point on is really dodgy. Some other strong arguments here, again, that are actually factual and not just us speculating on the psychology of the girls and what would you do in those situations, is the lack of data between the 7th and the 10th of April. How the bones were found, that they were found with no scratches that would indicate that they had actually been in the river and that the bodies had decomposed in the river, the fact that their clothes were not found except from Kris's short pants, and also the little bit of science that we have on the bones, that if it is true that they were found in water, that bones wouldn't have just floated up onto the surface. And when it comes to the foot in the shoe, Lisanne's foot, and the bleaching of Kris's bones, I truly believe that with some scientific progression, those would eventually be able to be explained, whichever theory you believe in. Here, so far, I see them as the arguments against the theory that an accident would have happened. And something that I put here that is also speculation and mostly just me thinking about the psychology of the girls, but if we are saying Lisanne lived longer, was tending to Kris, in my mind she wouldn't have left her body so close to the river, and even if she witnessed her friend die, usually if people have any strength, that is another thing that we don't know, but you'd think that they would try to have like a burial site for their friend, that they would try to like dig up a hole, like to make a grave for them in some way, and not just let them go into the river. But we don't know if both women were injured by this point, or also everything that I've just said is just speculation. Something that I find interesting that people aren't again super keen on online is that the last pictures of Lisanne were the thumbs up pictures on the summit, on El Mirador. So all of the other pictures beyond that point are of Kris, which I find strange that people aren't making up theories about that as much as I'd expect, as much as there's so many others here. So I made sure to include that in the arguments against. Again, let me know, and I put my own table and the flow onto the sheet as well if you want to leave comments, and if you want to add your own theories into different columns in different color. Now, the information that we need in order to make a decision of whether or not this was accident, I put some things that are again just psychological and can be speculative, like did they have maps on them, how detailed were those offline maps, did they have the physical ones, their sense of orientation, like were they, in Amersfoort, in Boquete, the girls that would never get lost, or were they the girls that would, just like me, you can place them somewhere and they wouldn't know where the hell they are. Some factual ones, like was the camera actually used in order to confirm the time? Can they confirm when was the camera switched on and off? Is that even doable with that type of camera? Was all of the data actually photoshopped? Can that be confirmed by official records? And then the other things that we need confirmed by official records are everything from the alibis to the analysis of the water bottle, soil, further DNA analysis on the bones, and discoveries of further remains. And in terms of the flow, I don't know what else to call this. It is basically the sequence of events, like it is how I picture any case. I know I'm a bit of a literalist Linda when it comes to that, but I do like to visualize things and to see where do I need to start asking questions, where it starts becoming illogical, and where do people insert their own theories rather than us having actual factual information, where it stops making sense, basically. Like if this case was to ever go to trial, if there was ever a culprit in this case, where would you think like, okay, this is beyond reasonable doubt, like we don't have enough evidence, we don't actually know necessarily everything about the case, but would this case have had enough to go to trial against somebody if somebody has been announced a culprit? And in that case, you know, where would you start asking questions? Like where would you stop buying into a story? So here I put what we know is that the girls have taken those pictures 507, 508, that they then move down the stream following the path, and then somewhere between 4 to 4:39, if they are in a fight or flight mode, they might have realized they didn't backtrack, you know, insert your own theory, they might have gone too far, and at that point they realized, okay, let us call the emergency services. This is when they go into survival mode. They plan to switch off their phones for the night because their batteries are low. They probably find a place to camp out in the pitch darkness somewhere. The next day, they might have switched their phones back on. They call the emergency services first thing in the morning. And then on the third, they establish a pattern, probably based on the movements of one of them, trying to find water, or just trying to find cell service. But then, where the flow stops is the fifth. Something changes. Did Kris have an accident? Is she still alive? Is Lisanne disorientated, trying to find help, just walking until the morning of the 8th, and then she decides to take the pictures of where Kris is, to signal to somebody something with that camera? And then why was their last phone activity on the 11th? As I said, I will poke holes in my own biases. So after, writing up all of this, after finding out a bit more about the psychology of fight or flight mode, of what people would do in certain circumstances, once they might have gotten lost or got involved in an accident, and after making my own list, trying to think of the flow, I have to ask myself, am I biased towards this? Because it is the most human theory. We all want to believe that one girl would have stuck next to each other. We can probably imagine ourselves getting lost, being thirsty, being dehydrated, being disorientated, and how we would react in those situations. So we can identify with these girls. We'd like to believe that these two girls stuck by each other until the very end, because it is the most human theory. And something where I've noticed my bias after having watched everything that is transcribed on this case online and having read so many of your theories in my own comments, in comments on Reddit, in comments on those other videos, we might simply not want to reduce these girls simply to their remains and the theories online. And that is why we might believe in a theory like this. I need to take cough syrup because I'm losing my fucking voice. Boy, am I having the best week of my fucking life. I'll be right back. I'm back, and hopefully you can hear me better. Now let us talk about foul play. Panama is a country of 4 million people that has a couple hundred murders each year. And these are just homicides, not even like manslaughter, not even like the mysterious homicides. Between January and September 2014, there were 468 murders in Panama. For comparison, I've checked UK, England and Wales, and there were 539 murders. And again, for comparison, England and Wales have the population of 67 million. As you can see from the graph on the screen, it seems to have dropped a little bit in 2015 and 2016, but it is sort of leveling up and it is on the rise now. And the highest number of homicides do correspond with the areas with highest number of gangs. On this map you can see different provinces of Panama and exactly how many gangs they have compared to the number of homicides. And even though Panama doesn't have as serious of a gang problem as other Central American nations like Honduras and El Salvador, the gangs are still believed to be behind the majority of the murders that were committed in the recent years. There is a particular gang that you guys told me to look into, and the only information that I could find was on Scarlett's blog. And the gang is called Los Niños de la Quinta, or the ND5 gang, the Children of the Fifth. People believe that the connection to this case comes from Henry, who was the guide F's stepson, who lives with him, and we spoke about the speculations about Henry having machete and just acting kind of unhinged in part 3. These are all, again, just speculations online, and the only connection to the gang and the girls could have been the death of Kris and Lisanne and the death of Osman, who was found as the searches were still happening. And also, if you've seen the night pictures, the one with the two pieces of red plastic bag, the one with the marker, apparently there is a number 5 that is visible on a stone in that picture. I don't see it. I literally zoomed in on this. I spent like 10 minutes trying to be like, is this the picture? So if you see it, let me know. Is this their signature move? If you know anything about this particular gang and how it can operate, again, let me know. I know that that is a dumb thing to say, because if you could let me know the ins and outs of the gang, you are probably belonging to that gang. But like, you know, if you have any inside info with like actual arguments and actual crimes that they have been connected to, and if you have actual confirmation that Feliciano and that whole lot is somehow connected to the gang. Let's briefly touch upon the organ trafficking. What would support this theory is the bleached bones. That maybe whoever, whether it is the person that lives on one of the fincas, on one of the ranches nearby, or if this is the actual organized crime, that they would have used phosphorus, that they would have used chemicals to make sure that any DNA is removed off the bones. Where I in particular would like to see further info, if anybody knows, is wouldn't the pelvic bone and one of the rib bones also indicate how they were removed? If it is organ harvesting, you are looking for specific organs that are kind of in like upper torso area, so wouldn't this be able to indicate that to us, that these organs have been removed? Because again, how proficient are people who would be harvesting these organs? Is this some legitimate operation with like hospitals and actual professionals, qualified people on hand? Or is this people who wouldn't really care about the bones and the remains? For example, according to the book interview with a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Nancy Shepard Hughes, she says organs are only useful for sale and organ transplants if they're stolen within a cartel working with a transplant team. In Mexico, there were many allegations that a violent drug trafficking gang were killing children for their organs. They were killers and terrorists, alright, who left in their trail many dead bodies minus organs, but the mutilations are used to terrorize communities, never to transplant units. You have to ask yourselves, if somebody was to preserve the organs, which I can understand the monetary gain there would be huge. The organ harvest, like, I'm not saying that this is an innocent theory that shouldn't have been looked into, but the risk there is high, because you do want to harvest and preserve these organs, because otherwise what are you getting out of it? But how do you make sure that they're properly harvested, then properly preserved, and then properly transported? The theory here would be that either the girls never made it to El Mirador, that everything is photoshopped, or that they met foul play beyond picture 508, and maybe they were picked up in that red pickup truck, they were seen going downhill, and somebody possibly transported them from there. But according to the book, a gang like this would be more likely to choose donors, who would provide less police interference than two Dutch tourists. And finally, then you have to ask yourself, well, why would people whose whole point is to make money off the organ harvesting, of the organ trafficking, would then even bother to add an extra risk and to plant those bones back into the forest beyond El Mirador? In terms of organized crime, the only other case that I've covered was on the mom, Miriam Rodriguez, who was avenging her daughter's death and eventually ended up being killed by Los Zetas herself. And in that story, I've seen like the aspect of the cartels trying to milk the families for ransom as much as possible. And then later, when they would dispose of all of these bodies, they would make sure that there is a process in place. Usually by that I mean incinerators, some form of trying to convert the bodies to ash. And in the cases of cartels, people who usually go to harass the families for ransom, or even people who are in charge of disposing of the bodies, are the people in the lowest ranks. Like, they give it to basically the people that want to prove themselves. So if something like this had happened in this case, again, there is a huge risk value that any form of organized crime operation will be disposed just purely by planting those bones and rucksack in that area. You might disagree and tell me that this is the exact MO of the gangs in the area, of the ND5 gang. You might be privy to more information, and if you are, let me know in the comments. A gang like this, or an operation like this, in my opinion, would only work if we can prove that one of the people living in those fincas that would have known of the girls being there, that, you know, is connected to this case somewhat, is one of the possible guides, or is one of their family members, and then the guides would have been trying to cover that up. Because you have to think there would have to be an inside man here, somebody who would know when the searches are conducted. I would be more willing, a lot more willing, to buy into any of those theories of any form of organized crime if we only had a connection of somebody that we have spoken about, or their family members belonging to one. If we had that confirmation, if they were involved in any previous crimes, then I think there are grounds to actually look into that. And how were they involved? Where were they in April that year? And then between April and June. Moving on towards the murky territory of similar disappearances, potential serial killers in the area, and do they connect to the case? In short, I would say no. You guys told me to look into one case in particular. The book mentions some. Just like with everything, there are people that believe nobody gets lost, and if they do, they will get found. And that is the case with some of the tourists. For example, there was a Colombian 33-year-old, Natalia Zuruaga, who got lost on the Pianista Trail in Boquete in 2016, but she was found by the rescue teams a day before she got lost. Then in another situation, there were two teachers that were found and rescued by SINAPROC and the police in a Nurum district, so not really Boquete. They were lost and phoned 911 until late afternoon, and the rescue teams found them at 3 in the morning. The teachers were found alive. They suffered signs of dehydration, bruises, hypothermia, and exhaustion, and they only disappeared on the day before. However, there are people who simply seem to vanish into thin air, who simply are never found, and if they are, it's really a murky territory into whether the right culprit is behind bars for their murder. So you told me to look into the case of Catherine Johannet, or Johannet, who is this American girl, and she was beaten and strangled in Bocas del Toro in 2017. A man, a minor, from what I remember, he's 17 years old at the time, confessed to murder, but people believe that he might not have been behind it. With Catherine's body, however, it could be confirmed that she suffered blunt force trauma to the back of her head and that she was strangled with her own swimsuit. The similarities between the two cases is that Catherine also went on a short hike that day. She went by herself, she left most of her personal belongings behind, and she was also young, white, and attractive, and a foreigner. In 2009, there was a case of a British backpacker called Alex Humphrey. He went to Boquete, checked into a hostel, and then apparently vanished into the thin air himself. It is said that he left that hostel and then decided to hike towards a waterfall approximately 4 kilometers away, but he has never been seen since. In this situation, no bones have been found, so Sinaproc again didn't even allow for the family to resort to an accident scenario, because in that case they would have found Alex during their multiple searches in the area. This, in people's minds, just like all of the other cases that you think of where people haven't been found alive, indicates to many that they have met foul play, and that is why none of their bones have been found. And you can also see this from two different perspectives. Like, of course, somebody, if it is the same gang, if it is the same cartel, organ harvesting gang, whoever you believe it is, well, they wouldn't follow the same MO that they did with Kris and Lisanne, right? Like, there was already a huge risk. Like, they might have realized the bodies haven't decomposed as fast as we intended them to. We shouldn't repeat this before because, whoa, they almost caught us. So they have changed their MO, and now no bones will be planted down the river. Or you can see a very limited amount of similarities between these cases compared to Kris and Lisanne's case. Speaking of similarities, I've looked into the serial killer possibility. The case of the missing student Catherine Johannet that I spoke about briefly is often linked to another case from 2012, the one of Ira Guerra. They are usually attributed to one person, but the modus operandi of these two kills is different. As I mentioned, Catherine was strangled with her own swimsuit, and Ira seemed to have gone through some form of torture, really. She died due to a sharp cut to the clavicle, but she had other cuts, other injuries to her body, skull, and hands. According to Crit, who wrote multiple articles for the Daily Beast, the similarities are that all three women set off for what they thought would be a short hike, that they left their most personal belongings behind in their rooms, and all of them were in their early 20s at the time of death. Another possible perpetrator here could have been the so-called Hannibal Lecter of Bugaba, Juan Pino Cardenas. I don't know what I expected when I heard Hannibal Lecter of a province, but I did not expect this. He just looks like your Tinder fuckboy. But he's dangerous, okay? Don't fuck with Hannibal. He was arrested in March 2017 for dismembering his 27-year-old partner, Luz Michelle Oroku. And the nickname is because he allegedly ate her flesh as well. The only connection here is that Luz's murder happened just west of Boquete, in the town of Los Centauras. so about 1.5 drive. So it's just that if it was a crime of opportunity, this kind of killer would have done it. And he also isn't a serial killer, just another killer in the area. Another possible suspect could have been Frank Pardo, who was a former sicario, assassin for the Mexican cartel. This man should be observed because he escaped the Mexican prison but then was arrested in May of 2009, and then he escaped again in 2013 once he was imprisoned in Panama. He only has one victim to his name apparently, but he hasn't been caught yet since he disappeared last, so that is the only connection, that he could have been free and operating near Boquete area. As you can see, there are not that many similarities in the areas where you would want them to be. The MO, the modus operandi, how the victims were killed, and even the victimology. You can see maybe more similarities to the victimology. You know, young foreign girls who would be an easy prey. But with the easy prey comes another catch, and that is publicity. You are, and I don't know the statistics on this, but there is a higher probability, I would say, for the more eyes and more eyes of the press to be on you if you were to kill a white young victim that is also foreign, because you have the press from her country, you have the press from Panama, and you have the added extra pressure, and with that comes the risk of getting caught. And when speaking about serial killers or just killers that want to be treated as such, that want more names and bodies to their name, usually they would confess to something like this. Like, this case is still big, and they would have probably learned about it when imprisoned for a single crime or multiple crimes. Especially, I would say, even more if you were imprisoned or if you are sicario, if you are trying to get back to work at a cartel as an assassin, because people would fear you more. And that brings us to the motivations. Rather, a motivation and then a potential cause or motivation for a cover-up. The one that I have seen in the book, in multiple theories online, it is the monetary motive. Whether you see this as a gang, as organ trafficking ring, or any form of organized crime, or even if you see this as a single individual striking because this was the crime of opportunity. The reward was, as we spoke in part 3, offered end of April. There were mentions of it in the interviews in the Netherlands as well in May. And the rucksack and the bones were found in June. So you have to think about the thought process of the individual who, once they hear the reward has been set up and before the evidence was found, decide to plant it. Multiple theories on this online, one of them saying that the thought process would be, well, to stage everything, to make the parents and everybody else believe that the girls are dead. The phone data, the photos would confirm that there was no foul play for the parents and the prosecution that find them in that rucksack. They snap those night pictures on the early morning of the 8th, they check Kris's iPhone on the 11th, and then all that is left for them is to just sit and wait for a perfect moment to plant that backpack and the bones. This, in people's minds, would explain why the girl's parents went along with the accident scenario. Because if they were to stay behind the foul play scenario, then they would probably have to pay the money to either Irma, the indigenous woman, or somebody, whoever pointed her to the bones. I hate this theory personally because I just hate when people start involving the family members without a shred of evidence, without just like anything confirming that this is correct. I would like to know, as I mentioned in part 3, what happened with that reward. Is there still a tip line? Is there still anybody that can receive any information on this case? Whether it is their private investigators and lawyers, or whether it is somebody in Panama, because I couldn't find it online, and I completely understand why you can't find it online, because I've been researching this for 3 weeks now, and the amount of theories that are just next level, online are overwhelming, so I kind of understand why there probably might not be a tip line, and they might just be following stories or waiting for something to come out that is in any way, shape or form factual, correct, can explain what happened to Kris and Lisanne. I went off there, but let us not blame the parents without an actual shed of the evidence. Also, if you have watched a single video, including the ones that I'm playing during this part or any of the parts, you know how both of those family members have tried everything while they were in Panama. They have even hired a lawyer to go after the prosecution team. They have created the answers for Kris, pages for any sorts of clues. Like, I don't really buy it in this case. Something that could potentially be looked into in this area is it that the searches have suddenly expanded, right? So they have probably searched the closest places first, like the closest farms, the closest fincas, the flower shops, etc. And then they would have expanded, they would have gone even to Alto Romero. So is it that somebody who had known of the searches expanding would have planted the evidence there? And then who was that somebody? Who was the person that hasn't been accounted for? Who was the person that would have had the opportunity? Of course, there are other monetary aspects and monetary gains of this crime, and it could be all connected. It could be that this is some form of an organ harvesting ring, and they would benefit from selling somebody's organs, and then also the person on the inside, the person that is planting this evidence, the person that wants the reward, would also benefit on their own. And if so, if any of these options is true, if people did it for reward money, if people did it for an even higher amount of profit, they would have wanted it covered up for the sake of tourism, if nothing else, because this is what legally brings Panama the most money annually. And from what I found online, this case hasn't impeded that. In 2019, internal travel and tourism consumption in Panama added up to about 7.45 billion US dollars, upwards of about 80 billion from the year before. Meaning that this is something that you would want protected at all costs. If you look at the bigger picture, if they charge anybody, even if it is a member of a gang, a tour guide, nobody would want to come to Panama, because that would reflect on everybody in a negative light, especially after all this time. Like, it would show the incompetency of the prosecution office, and it would definitely make the news if this case was suddenly solved, and it was solved as some form of crime. But even on a smaller scale, if you are saying that this is crime of opportunity and it was done by one of the tour guides, well, then you can see how nobody would want to come to Panama through a travel agency to go learn Spanish. That school might need to shut. The guide tours would be out of business, like the chain reaction would follow. And this to me connects with what I've said in part 1, that it would be personal. That this is the type of place where everybody knows everybody and people would stick by one another. Ever since I've heard that, this cover-up is for the sake of tourism, it just never sat right with me. Because let's say you actually know of this case, right? Like, you're here, you've been with me for 4 parts, you're a fucking legend. Let's say you have, read all of the blogs, have even more knowledge than me, which isn't hard somehow, have read all of the Reddit threads, know this case inside and out, basically. Are you still going to Panama? Are you still going to Boquete knowing the resolution? Or would you only go if somebody has actually been arrested? Not somebody, but the right person has actually been charged with a crime. Because that's what I don't necessarily understand. It is a personal opinion. Maybe you have already been between 2014 and now, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't just decide to go until I know that a case like this has been resolved. But we can't really talk about the cover-up in this case without mentioning the swimming theory, as it's known online, or the caldera theory. I'm not gonna lie to you, I was not aware of this, and then I went into it expecting miracles, okay? I have really high expectations of things, and then I just don't see it. I don't see it as a fixation. Don't get me wrong. A theory that states that four people that have taken a happy picture in a stream together, all dying within a year, sounds interesting, sounds like a freaking cover-up. Then when you actually learn that in real life, two people that have some form of connection with this case did die, even if we believe that the other two people in that stream picture aren't the girls, again, sounds plausible, sounds like there is something there. And I'm definitely not saying that there isn't. I do think if there is proof that the girls have met these two individuals, that this is extremely suspicious, it should be looked into, and I would probably start from there, really, unless, you know, more bones are uncovered, or unless science progresses, or unless somebody comes forward with like some water current theories, rather again proving them. But I just don't like what it's hanging on. I think we need to explore more avenues, because there's so many theories surrounding this picture, there's so many people analyzing it, and I just think we need to broaden our horizons and find out more about these two individuals rather than focusing on one single picture. Within a year of the girl's disappearance, there were 3 suspicious deaths that might be connected to certain people in this case. The first one, I mentioned in part 3, was of Osman Valenzuela, who disappeared 3 days after the girls went missing, who was one of the people searching for them, and was then found on the 5th, if I remember right, dead from drowning. Then there was Jose Manuel Murgos, who apparently worked with Osman, and he was killed a year later in a hit-and-run collision. After he died, Henry, Feliciano's stepson, apparently wrote on his Facebook page that Jose was his little soul brother. Both of these men allegedly belonged to the gang. And then the third one is Leonardo Arturo Gonzalez, who was the taxi driver that brought the girls to the head of the trail. Later, he also was found drowned in a river in March of 2015. Now that you know of the 3 individuals, let us break down the whole picture. So it is said that in this picture people see Kris and Lisanne. Supporting evidence is that there are no straps on the swimming suits, and that the swimming suits look like the ones found in the rucksack, that the girls' faces look the same, that one of them had blondish hair, the other one had darker hair. When it comes to the man in this picture, people do believe, based off of the clothes, based off of the facial features, that one of these men was Osman. His phone was seized by the police once he died, and the word on the streets or by the media is that his family never got his phone back. So maybe one of them released this picture, because we don't know when this picture is taken, A, where exactly it's taken, when it was published, why, and by whom. And I would argue that we don't know who the people in the picture are, because it's taken from across that stream, it's extremely pixelated. As much as you zoom it in, I just don't think that this is the hill for somebody to die on. From what we know from the timelines from their diaries, this picture could have only been taken on the 1st, if we suppose that this is Kris and Lisanne in the picture. This means that after El Pianista, after they were at the caldera, they would have continued down the trail, maybe met these 2 men, Osman and his friend Jose, and then gone to a caldera for a swim. There's a bunch of speculations if you want to go down this rabbit hole online on where exactly this caldera is it even visible in one of the night pictures, which, if it is, and the theory is that these men killed the girls, that would be like super dumb, but sure. And that after having some fun with these 2 men that they have met, well, they realize that they might be in danger. They make that emergency phone call and then the men notice and they take their phones off and the men will be the ones switching the phones. As a theory, that could potentially flow. There are people saying that based off of where this location would have been, that the time would be really limited. That like the girls, if this was to have happened, would not have spent much time with the two men before making that emergency call. But do we have any proof that the girls actually met any of the men? Osman, his friend, even the cab driver. According to the book, Osman was seen by the witnesses on the afternoon of the April the 1st in a car with Kris and Lisanne. This would have indicated that the women actually did return to Boquete and then had gone to the hot springs with the couple of boys. And this would also mean that the night pictures haven't been taken on the other side of the Mirador, but rather at the stream before it. Allegedly, after that, the story goes that in a local restaurant, Osman was actually threatened by a group of youths after he was talking about Kris and Lisanne's disappearance, and this group of youths said, "You are dead." And then he does end up dead in the circumstances where people don't believe that he actually drowned, because the position his body was found in was curved and could indicate that he received a blow to the back of his head. Then the next year, his friend Jose is found dead on the highway to David, and he was one of the boys who was present at the restaurant when Valenzuela had been threatened. The locals would say that this was hit and run, but others would say that his throat had been cut. And then finally, Leonardo, the cab driver, who drowned in March of 2015, he was one of the taxi drivers that the witnesses have seen with the women alive. Because of that, the belief is that he, just like the other two, have been silenced. My question to you, if you believe in this theory, is there more information on who, when, why the picture was released, all of that? Is there more confirmation that these two men were there, that they actually knew Kris and Lisanne, that she was actually driven by this cab driver? How do you see it happen? Like, make it flow for me. And do you believe that Kris and Lisanne were killed by the two men because they're members of the gang, because of the stepson, Feliciano's stepson association? There are too many gaps, and that is why, like, I definitely think there is no coincidence in three men, if they did blow Kris and Lisanne, if we have the proof of that, having died that same year, having died in a span of a year. I think that there is something to it, because I don't believe in coincidences. But in order for it not to be a coincidence, we need the proof that they had known the two women, and that whole caldera picture is actually for people that we are speaking of, for the theory to be true, for the whole aspect of a cover-up to be true. What is left to speak about is the theory that would connect to the red pickup truck. And here I see it happening in two ways. Either foul play, when one person would lure these women, somebody that they potentially knew, somebody from the school, or one of the guides that they would have trusted. Then they're on a truck in the middle of nowhere, realize that they are being driven by the roads that they don't know, realize that they're in danger, and then either this one person leads them to a location where they're overpowered, or they're overpowered right then and there. And the second option that I see happening here is that they were overpowered from the get-go, that this was an attack, they had been kidnapped and taken to a secondary location. In this theory, the perp would have to dispose of this vehicle afterwards, change the license plates, do something about it. We spoke briefly about it in part 3, and apparently the local authorities managed to find the person who was in the truck at that time on El Pianista Trail. But unless somebody actually checked for the license plates, we can't really know for sure. And the way that I said that the digital data might be the strongest point when it comes to the accident In my opinion, the biggest pro for foul play would be Lisanne's and Kris's bones, especially Kris's bleached bones. In order for the bones to have been bleached by sunlight, the flesh must no longer be present, so the bones need to be exposed. The bones would also need to be directly in the path of the sunlight, and they would need to be exposed for a long period of time. As we know, there were very few sunny days in May and June, and according to the sources online, sun's exposure would demonstrate extreme bleaching gradients, meaning that the bones wouldn't be bleached equally. And according to Kris's blog, by observing the pelvic bone, you can't see any visible surface cracking or flaking, meaning that grease or fat, like body fat, would have also been removed by chemicals. And also, you could assume that the river would wash away the blood, but Kris's bones had no blood on them or inside of them either, and that is consistent with the phosphorus traces demonstrating that the chemicals have been used. It could be that the lime and the lye would be present in the soil near the rivers because of the farms nearby, because of the amount of fincas, the amount of cattle passing by every day, but for that we would need some soil testing. But if you join the bleached bones with the quick decomposition, you can see that there are a couple of factors that would really support the foul play theory. And here to support that, you can actually see that the difference in decomposition actually play along to the utilization of chemicals. So if person tried to use chemicals on Kris's body, they were probably an amateur, they weren't like super professional at this, because the soft tissue had some rapid decomposition showing, while the bones experienced mild chemical alteration, and then later the bone composition process has been stopped. But with Lisanne, we see that her foot decomposed differently from her leg bones, so we could conclude that the remains went through an unnatural process, because had they not, the decomposition would show that the remains had articulated, so they would have been decomposed to the same level. If we put that into the arguments pro and against, I think the bones here are the strongest argument pro foul play. That combined with the digital data, the photo 509 being deleted by somebody else, the lack of the images of the girls after picture 508, the fact that the rescue dogs haven't found anything in the first days of their disappearance, and the multiple motivations that we have. And then when it comes to the arguments against, we again have a ton of speculations, the possible options on why somebody would risk this way. That if we buy into some parts of the autopsy reports, we have to believe that Kris was killed first and then Lisanne was killed after, so that she has exerted herself. How would that work logistically when you're keeping two decomposing bodies going through different stages at a secondary location? In terms of digital data here, there is the phone pattern shifting on the 5th, the picture of Kris's hair, and I put something that I kept thinking of when covering this story, and that is what is the type of criminal that we see committing this kind of crime. If it is a motive of sexual nature, even if it is for monetary gain, that person, in my mind, would have had a previous criminal record, and probably more importantly, wouldn't be able to contain their urges for this many years and would have struck again. So maybe it is that they have struck again and we just haven't connected it to this crime. Maybe it is that this is not the type of criminal we are looking for because this is just speculation. Or maybe this might not have included foul play to begin with. And the information that we need to make a decision here, the DNA matches on everything, can they be completely excluded? Can further DNA testing be done? Who processed and deleted the picture 509? Alibis on the people, finding the rest of the remains and heads. Further DNA tests on the bones, finding out was there presence of lime, in what form, what exactly there was the presence of, and then checking and verifying the fincas in the area. This probably wouldn't yield any results 7 years later unless the individual is super dumb, because the investigation into this case messed up so brilliantly. But certain tests on the water bottle, if that was still kept in the records, if anybody has ever done them and can release them, further searches of the farms nearby for the remains of the girls, or further searches for the phosphates, for the chemicals that have been found on them, for that lime or lye, anything that has been found on Kris's bleached bones. And then possibly also the search for any weapons that these farm owners have, and checking if they had been examined, if they are registered, if they had been sold by that point, if anybody had gotten rid of them. Basically, the info we need is for somebody to look at this case from a perspective of it being a crime. Because you would investigate cases differently when you know that it is homicide, when you know it is an accident, when you know it's a disappearance. You just look at them differently. You look for different things. And that is something that hasn't been given due diligence here. They have went into this with a tunnel vision to begin with, and that is why we don't have the answers. And there are only possibly limited answers that we might have one day. Here, in terms of the flow, I put the girls took those pictures, then they moved from the stream following the path. Guide F then probably heard from Ingrid that the girls will be at the Pianista trail, and then as they're walking, they maybe spot him, they might recognize him, or he identifies himself as the guide. Somebody spots them and they believe that this person can be trusted, or simply somebody overpowers them because the guide and possibly other people don't really even speak English. This person or people suggest that they take them down the hill. The girls accept the ride, knowing that their batteries are low, and then they're driven, and suddenly they don't realize the road, they realize they're not going towards Miriam's house. But then where this flow stops for me is later. Something criminal happens to them, and then Kris is killed first, Lisanne a few days later, then they just sit and wait, and once they think it's safe, they dispose of the bodies and they plant them in that area. One of the flows or the completion of the list that I would like to see is how do you discard one thing from the other? Because here what doesn't make sense to me is the digital data. So here, for that to happen, I mean, why? Why would you risk it? Why would you do any of it? Like, it's just an extra thing. Like, if it is an organized crime, surely you have different priorities than ensuring that the girls switch their phones on and off around the same time every day. I don't know, that's just how I see it. And then on one night you just decide to go wherever to take some ambiguous pictures, and then you take that picture of Kris's hair, but you make sure nothing else is included in it. Just why? And I know the answer is to prove that they were alive, Maya. But they could have also discarded of all of the digital evidence, making sure that they don't have to like switch the phones on and off, etc. And then also dispose of the bodies in time to try to claim that reward, if that is the sequence of events that we see. Now, a thought crossed my mind and I was like, this is the dumbest thought that you have ever had in your life. So I was like, let me whip out a list. The thought being, what if it could be both? Because we had discrepancies in both areas. So how does it flow if the girls hadn't met foul play up until the 5th, when they would already be weak, possibly dehydrated, extremely hungry, and cold, and could be easily overpowered? It would match the data gap that we have between the 7th and the 10th. It would also match the pin attempts that we have and also the phone pattern from the couple of days that they had that same phone pattern that we thought was a survival instinct. The girls could have been a much easier target when they were exhausted. Photo 5 of 9 could have been taken any time between the 1st and the 8th. It would explain why the dogs couldn't locate the girls. Possibly the perpetrator would have felt confident to bring them right onto their farm, onto their ranch, because it was already searched. Lisanne's bones showed exertion, meaning that she could have still walked for about 5 days. Osman's body was suspiciously found on the 5th. It can even play into that theory. But then in all of these versions, why is photo 509 being deleted? Arguments against can also be the risk. How do they know when the searches are going to happen? How do they know exactly when to dispose of the bodies? The lack of the images after picture 508. That the digital data was actually left behind. Was Kris disposed of first, and that is when that picture of her hair was taken, and then Lisanne was disposed later, because that is even a further risk. There are no notes to their family. That doesn't fit this theory whatsoever. And then there was no reward that would have been set up by that point that they would know they can cash out on. The information that we need is the cell tower data for the phones on the 7th and the 11th. I think one of these theories, the return to Pt.4 one, could truly be discarded by the cell data, because they would have had cell service if they returned to Pt.4. Then the alibis of people involved, findings of the rest of the remains, and just further searches of the farms for human remains. This theory, just like the others, doesn't really flow well. It has the least amount of points, really, from what I gathered, even though it seems like the arguments pro and against kind of make sense. How are they overpowered? By whom? At what point during the day? Where were they held hostage? Why would one of them be killed first, the other one second? Why were the bodies found in different decomposing stages? Surely, as a perp, you would want both bodies to be completely decomposed. And then something that supports foul play theories, but also, again, just like everything else, doesn't. Both skulls were missing, which you would assume that then, if foul play happened, if they were killed, any impact would have happened to the skulls. Because, the rest of the bodies, well, we found rib and pelvis and then Lisanne's leg bones. It doesn't match up the area of the body where they were found. Where are the skulls? Where would you plot them as a perpetrator? Where would you dispose of them? Surely again there is an additional risk added to that. My final pondering when it comes to the foul play theories, and I have heard this on a completely unrelated topic. I think it was listening to My Dad Wrote a Porno, the podcast, which is comedy, it's not true crime. And one of them said about the plot that, well, the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was what set in motion First World War. But his assassination isn't why the war had happened. There were other events at play. If we were to apply that same theory here, foul play happened either in the name of something sinister, whether it is organized crime or whether it is somebody who already has a criminal record and is familiar with the world of crime, who just saw an opportunity and it was covered up in the name of tourism. I, however, think that whatever theory you buy into, that this case is solvable. Whether it is by advances in technology, whether it is with the experts in different areas, soil analysis, water currents, connecting this to an already known perp if we are buying into foul play, tracing down the events of those days, going back and checking people's alibis, testing for further DNA analysis, and again, science advances in that area. But I think the key to it would be giving it as much due diligence and treating this as if the crime took place. Whoever has those files, whoever has the access to them, that is where I would start. Just immediately taking out the possibility that this was an accident, that this was the girls getting lost, and purely taking it in as if a crime had happened. Investigating alibis, locations, possible potential weapons and perps that were examined and looked into versus the one that weren't. Kris died when she was 21. Lisanne was 22. Both of these women left their families and their siblings and friends behind. Both of them chose to spend their gap year enjoying life, advancing their skills while volunteering and working with children. Let's treat them in death the way they lived their life, with passion and kindness, and not only reduce these girls to their circumstances of the day of 1st of April and the way their bodies were found. Yes, my voice is cracking, speaking about how tragic this whole story is and how tragic that police investigation was, but also it's pretty much gone. I'm sorry for what I put you through during these last few parts. I am actually so sorry, but I've been going through it, and I don't know if my great-grandma will pass away and I will have to go home, and I just wanted to put this out there. And I've also been having nightmares for the past 3 weeks, just going in depth in this case, so I just want you all to be respectful in the comments, especially in the sheet. Don't make me wipe that shit out from the place of the earth. And as I said, whatever you put out there, don't reduce these girls just to their bones and just to the ways that they were found, just to the digital data. Because it is one thing that it is needed for the investigation into this, whether it is an accident or whether it is foul play, but we need to see these two girls as human beings as well. And I hope at least some of this research, some of these multiple hours that went into it and are put out there, have done that part justice, at least. Thank you for listening, and I will be back with you with another case once my voice is back, once I probably go through grief, and hopefully next week, but I'll keep you guys in the loop. Wow, aren't you just a bundle of fucking joy? Okay. Bye guys. Bye guys! Don't speak. For the rest of the day, no speaking.